Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we think of the 1849 California gold rush, our minds almost instantly conjure up a very specific, romanticized image, don't they? We picture that rugged, independent prospector striking it rich with just a flick of his wrist and a gleaming pan, living out this grand frontier adventure. But today, we're going to reconstruct the actual human world of the diggings. We're going to strip away the Hollywood myth entirely and use the historical record to examine the visceral, unromanticized, and often absolutely brutal reality of everyday life in the mid-19th century. We're taking an intellectual journey straight into the mud, the disease, the economic traps, and the profound human and environmental costs of the motherlode.
To truly understand this era, we first have to grasp the sheer mortality of the journey itself. Imagine reading this letter from a gold seeker who was sailing north from Panama. He wrote, "There was 17 died before we got halfway." It brilliantly and tragically illustrates that before a miner even picked up a shovel, they had to survive a literal gauntlet of cholera, malaria, and scurvy on completely overcrowded ships or across brutal, unforgiving overland trails. The cost in human lives just to reach California was, frankly, appalling.
And once they finally arrived, the reality of the work set in almost immediately. Think about the physical toll. The work wasn't a treasure hunt. It was hours upon hours of bending, sluicing, and hauling unbelievably heavy, wet gravel. Picture standing up to your knees in freezing snowmelt while the California sun just beats down on your back. It was grueling, back-breaking labor that closely resembled the absolute most punishing seasonal agricultural work you can imagine.
Now, if the work was exhausting, their living conditions provided exactly zero sanctuary. In the early rush, home was literally just a canvas tent pegged directly into the freezing mud. It was sweltering in the summer, freezing in the winter, and totally prone to just washing away entirely during the relentless seasonal rains. Eventually, some men managed to build rudimentary 16 by 20 foot log cabins. But as 49ers described them, these cabins were windowless, choked with smoke from continuously burning logs, and perpetually infested with fleas, flies, and lice.
You have to remember, this was a profoundly isolated, all-male society. It forced tens of thousands of young men, who were completely unaccustomed to domestic work, to cook, clean, and survive entirely on their own. They slept on bedsteads corded with strips of rawhide mesh, covered only in dry mountain ferns and heavy buffalo skins. They literally burned their clothes trying to iron them. And they were navigating this incredibly high-stress environment without the traditional frameworks of family, community, or established law to anchor them.
But here is where the historical reality truly shatters the myth. Yes, it's true, a miner might pull $10 to $16 of gold out of the river in a single day, which was a fortune compared to East Coast wages at the time. But systemic inflation ruthlessly neutralized almost all the labor value they generated. To put that into perspective, a single egg could cost the equivalent of over $90 today. $90! And a pound of butter, over 500 modern dollars.
So, this brings us to a crucial question. Who actually got rich? Well, the true fortunes of the gold rush were not built by those exhausted men standing in the muddy rivers. They were built by the merchants. Men like Sam Brannan realized early on that a man carrying a pickaxe and a dream was essentially a captive customer. Merchants charged whatever the desperate traffic would bear, selling $80 gold pans and $1,000 shovels. The lasting wealth, it turns out, was extracted not from the earth, but from the miners themselves.
Naturally, this economic extortion had immediate devastating effects on the miners' physical health, and it started right with their diet. Because imported provisions were so unbelievably expensive, these young men survived on salt pork, dry beans, and sourdough. That $50 butter shipped all the way around Cape Horn, it was often so rancid it had to be treated with chloride of lime just to be swallowed without gagging. Fresh fruits and vegetables were incredibly rare luxuries. A jar of pickles might cost the equivalent of $250. And because they ignored basic nutritional wisdom in their rush for wealth, scurvy ruthlessly stalked the camps.
And the medical horrors certainly didn't stop at scurvy. With virtually non-existent sanitation and totally unregulated waste disposal, the very streams the miners relied on for drinking water became heavily contaminated with fecal matter. This bred catastrophe. Cholera, which was terrifyingly known in the camps as the Blue Death, could strike a totally healthy man in the morning and kill him through extreme dehydration by nightfall. Just to give you an idea of the scale, during the 1850 epidemic in Sacramento, over 1,000 people died in a matter of weeks.
To make matters even worse, medical science in the 1840s was shockingly primitive. Diagnosis was basically guesswork. When miners fell ill with dysentery, malaria, or altitude sickness, the treatments were often just as dangerous as the diseases themselves. Desperate men dosed themselves with massive quantities of opium, mercury, and these completely unregulated quack patent medicines that promised miracle cures, but really delivered nothing but further physical ruin.
I want you to consider the stark reality of this single figure, 20%. According to historical estimates, 1 in 5 gold seekers died within just 5 months of arriving in the mining districts. Just let that sink in. The combination of grueling labor, freezing conditions, starvation diets, and rampant disease turned the so-called promised land into an absolute graveyard.
Now, as the easily accessible surface gold was rapidly depleted, the very nature of mining had to evolve. Desperation drove this intense technological escalation. They went from the simple pan to the wooden rocker to the long tom, which required a whole team of men to operate. Finally, by 1853, the industry had morphed entirely. It now required massive capital and serious engineering, culminating in hydraulic water cannons.
And this technological shift brings us to a really profound socioeconomic transformation. By 1852, the average daily yield for an independent miner had completely plummeted. The myth of the free-acting, self-directed prospector basically died in the mud. To survive, the independent 49er had to surrender his pick and shovel and go to work for large, heavily capitalized mining corporations. He was no longer an adventurer, right? He was just a corporate wage laborer right back where he started, only thousands of miles from home.
The psychological toll of all this was just immense. Imagine the nerve-wearing boredom when the relentless winter rain set in, halting all work and trapping these men inside their smoky, leaky cabins for weeks on end. The social fabric of the camps completely unraveled. Disappointed dreams, profound homesickness, and the overwhelming isolation of a purely masculine society actively aided and abetted rampant alcoholism and gambling. Thousands of men left the diggings with completely broken-down constitutions, never to fully recover.
But as we look at the tragedies that befell the miners, we must address the darkest and most devastating reality of this era with unflinching historical objectivity. The massive, uncontrolled influx of hundreds of thousands of miners into California brought catastrophic, genuinely apocalyptic consequences to the indigenous populations who had lived there for thousands of years.
This hostility wasn't just a byproduct of a few rogue settlers. It was entirely foundational to the state's early governance. California's first governor, Peter Hardenman Burnett, explicitly called for a war of extermination in his second State of the State address. The state's early legislative sessions literally allowed white settlers to arrest native peoples at will, enslave their children, and they formed armed militias that were heavily subsidized by state and federal authorities.
The result of these policies was genocide. An estimated 16,000 native Californians were slaughtered in state-sanctioned massacres between the 1840s and 1870s. The pre-statehood native population, which had already suffered terribly under Spanish colonization, plummeted from around 150,000 to just 30,000. It is a staggering, horrific human cost that forever stains the legacy of the gold rush.
That insatiable hunger for gold spared neither the original inhabitants nor the land itself. Ultimately, it unleashed the final, most destructive stage of extraction technology, hydraulic mining. Miners figured out how to divert entire rivers into narrow channels, funneling the water downhill into high-pressure iron cannons called monitors.
The environmental ruin was absolute. These water cannons shot hundreds of gallons of water per second with such tremendous force they could unroof buildings and easily move rocks the size of cars. Entire mountainsides were literally washed away into sluices. The surrounding forests were clear-cut for timber to build flumes. The resulting toxic debris, which was heavily contaminated with mercury used in the extraction process, choked the river systems, causing massive, devastating floods in the agricultural communities downstream. The landscape was permanently, irreversibly scarred.
So as we look at the historical record, synthesizing the immense human suffering, the economic exploitation, the state-sponsored violence, and the environmental devastation, a really grim reality emerges. For the vast majority of those who rushed west, the grand illusion of easy wealth evaporated in those freezing streams. The treasure at the end of the rainbow was, all too often, simply a forgotten grave in a nameless canyon.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. When we examine the systems that structured everyday existence back in 1849, we really have to ask ourselves, who actually wins during historical resource rushes? And looking at the shattered health, the extreme isolation, and the moral compromises of the camps, what truly constitutes a good life? It deeply challenges our modern assumptions about ambition and wealth, doesn't it?
I hope this journey leaves you a bit haunted by the ghosts of the diggings and eager to look a whole lot closer at the hidden realities of history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.